Hi. Um, I just wanted to video myself reading this introduction for you because I just had to do this. Um, I was having a really hard day today. There's no electricity at the moment in our house. It's raining, and I just had some time, and I was feeling a little bit lost today. And I picked up this book. This is the cover, obviously. Cassandra Speaks by Elizabeth Lesser, and I just read the introduction and I cried a bunch and underlined a bunch of things, and I just needed this introduction. It's only 14 shorter pages, and I really want to read it for you. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it reminds you of how incredible you are. So here's the book. We'll start with our page 1. I'm sorry if there's a little bit of echo, but hopefully the rain will make it a bit smoother. We're just going to start. This is a book about stories. The stories a culture tells and how these stories become the culture. It's about the stories we still blindly cling to and the ones that cling to us. The origin stories, the guiding myths, the religious parables, the stories passed down through the centuries about women and men, power and war, sex and love, and the values by which we live. Stories written mostly by men, yet the lessons and laws for all of humanity. We have outgrown so many of them, and still they endure. This book is about those old stories, and it's about what happens when women are the storytellers too. When we speak from our authentic voices, when we flex our values, when we become protagonists in the tales we tell about what it means to be human. And so I will start with a story. It takes place on a summer day at Omega Institute, the education and retreat center I co-founded right out of college. Today, Omega is a thriving institution, offering hundreds of workshops and conferences every year on its campus in upstate New York. At the time of my story, I was the only woman in leadership at Omega. I was also a harried single mother, juggling work and parenting, trying to squeeze the impossible into each day. There's a room in Omega's dining hall where faculty can share a meal and mingle ideas. On any given day, there's an eclectic mix of innovative thinkers in that room. From medical researchers to indigenous healers, from yogis to scientists, and from NBA basketball players to Nobel Peace Prize winners. On this day, I was surrounded by speakers and teachers having fascinating conversations, but instead of chatting with them with them about breakthroughs in cancer care or mindfulness meditation or sports psychology, I have engaged in a familiar debate with my 2 little boys. I wanted them to eat a healthy lunch. They wanted to pedal their bikes down to the country store to buy fried chicken and ice cream cones. The boys won the debate and ran gleefully out into the summer day. By then, almost everyone else had finished lunch and left the room, but in the corner, bent over a book and slurping cream from something soup, was one straggler, a woman with short gray hair, thick reading glasses, a university classics professor who was part of a conference exploring the power of myth in modern culture. She had just published a book, a retelling of ancient legends from the point of view of the women in the stories. I had yet to read it. It was one of many books stacked on my bedside table, a common phenomenon for people who love to read but also have children and a job. I was about to leave the faculty dining room when I noticed something disconcerting. The woman in the corner, the classics professor, was so lost in the reading that she absent-mindedly dribbling soup on the front of her sweater. But actually, it was my sweater. I had offered it to her the evening before when we met for the first time at a faculty orientation. She took, "Oh, you look cold," I had said, and she nodded and took the sweater without a word in response. What an odd person, I thought. Now I sat watching her, and my sweater, spellbound. Sensing my eyes on her, the professor looked up and motioned to me. She pointed to the chair across the table from her. I went over, sat down, and within minutes, I would not have cared if she had dumped a whole tureen of soup on my sweater, because she told me a story that turned out to be the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking. The story got under my skin and stayed with me. It set in motion a cascade of critical choices I would make over the next few years, choices that would help me reclaim my voice, my courage, my self-worth. Our conversation began lightly enough. I asked the professor if her room was pleasant, if she was sleeping well, how her class was going. Fine, she mumbled, waving away each question with her soup spoon. Then she lifted her eyes and peered at me. "And how is your life going?" she asked. "Not so well," I answered. I was surprised to hear myself divulge. Suddenly, I was telling this strange stranger about a meeting I'd been in earlier that day, and not just that meeting, but situations I found myself in over and over at work. I told her how frustrated I was as a woman leader, how it was like speaking a second language, how I was learning that language as fast as I could, but the guys I worked with didn't seem interested in learning my language, understanding my insights, enacting my priorities. I could see some important changes the organization needed to make. I could see what would happen if we didn't make those changes, but no one listened. Occasionally, something I had unsuccessfully argued for would resurface as someone else's brilliant idea. I spent my days either capitulating or complaining. I didn't like who I was becoming. "All I do is complain," I told the professor. "I'm pissed off all the time. No one listens to me. I feel kind of crazy." The professor took another slurp of soup. Then she put down her spoon and sat quietly for a few moments. "I've been thinking a lot about Cassandra," she finally said. "You remember her, of course." "Barely," I admitted. "Well then, I'll remind you. Cassandra was a princess from the city of Troy. She was the most beautiful of King Priam and Queen Hecuba's daughters. As such, she had many suitors, both mortal and immortal." The professor looked around the empty room and then lowered her voice, as if including me in some ancient gossip. "Zeus, king of the gods, was after Cassandra, and so was his son Apollo. To woo her, Apollo gave her something only a god could give, the coveted gift of seeing into the future. But when he tried to seduce her, Cassandra refused his sexual advances. This enraged Apollo. Instead of taking the gift of prophecy away, he grabbed her, spat in her mouth, and put a curse on her. "You will remain clairvoyant, Cassandra," he said. "But now no one will listen to you. No one will believe your predictions. So no matter what she foresaw, from the sacking of Troy to the death of her brothers, to the multiple tragedies that would befall her people, no one believed Cassandra. She was eventually driven mad by knowing the truth and being doubted when she spoke it. Her final dignity came at the end of the Trojan War, as her city lay in ruins, just as she had prophesied. She was abducted and raped by a Greek warrior. As the professor spun me the tale of Cassandra, I began to feel less and less as if she was speaking about characters from a Greek myth, and more as if she was speaking about women in general, in ancient times and our times. Finally, she'd said, "Listen here, young lady. Women have been ignored, ridiculed, punished, even killed for their opinions forever. But without the balancing power of her voice, the female voice, things in this world end in disaster. Cassandra's tale is your tale. It is all of our tales. We must speak, and we must be taken seriously. We must change the way the story ends." "But how?" I asked, my voice rising, thinking about the meeting I had been in that morning. "I tried, but they don't listen to me." The professor gave me the side eye. "Your tone right now. That's the first step. Stop whining. Are you going to be a doomed prophetess, or are you going to find a different voice and save your city?" "Well, that sounds a little overblown. I run a conference center. These are not life or death issues." "Ah, but they are. It doesn't matter where you work, what you do, where you live. Women know something that the world needs now. We know it in our bones. We've always known it." "Yeah," I answered, "that sounds good, but shh." The woman put her finger to her lips. "Listen," she whispered. "Listen to Cassandra." Now she looked less like a professor from a prestigious university and more like a benevolent witch from a fairy tale. She reached across the lunch table and put her hand on my hand. "Cassandra, when Cassandra speaks, we must listen. There's work to do. Listen to her and then get to work." She patted my hand, stood up, ran a napkin over her chest, smearing the soup into my sweater, and left the dining room. I never saw the sweater again. I never saw the professor again, and I never forgot the story of Cassandra. From then on, during crisis and crossroads at work, or whenever it was time for me to step up and take a risk for what I believe in, for what I knew to be right, I conjured up Cassandra. I called on her to help me find my voice, to trust my values, and to change the way the story ends. I have been calling on her ever since in my own life and as a prayer for the world. I know in my bones that we can break Cassandra's curse, that we can dispel our culture's enduring mistrust and devaluing of women, and when we do, all of humanity will benefit. In the past few years, I have thought of Cassandra's story almost every day as more and more women demand to be heard and trusted. I have thought about other stories too, ancient and modern ones, a whole brew of stories that people have been absorbing for centuries. Stories that tell false and destructive narratives about men and women, femininity and masculinity, and the nature and purpose of life. Stories we would be wise to scrap and replace with healthier ones. Part 1 of this book, Origin Stories, explains some of the old tales, starting with Adam and Eve, the most influential couple in Western culture. Here's a mini refresher of our prevailing origin story. In the beginning, life was great in the Garden of Eden, until God noticed that Adam needed a helpmate. And so he made Eve, the first woman. Then Eve got curious, listened to a snake, seduced Adam into disobeying God, and everything after that went downhill. The fall. That's the foundation, the one that sets all of the others up. The first story to paint womankind as second in creation and first to sin. The tagline brands our culture. It's our DNA. It informs our daily lives. It lives in our bodies. To give you a taste of the legacy passed down to us from Adam and Eve, here are 3 quotes from writings I explore in greater detail in part 1. From Tertullian, an early Christian writer, often called the founder of Western theology. In pain you shall give forth children, woman, and you shall turn to your husband, and he shall rule over you. And do you not know that you are Eve? God's sentence hangs still over all your sex, and his punishment weighs down upon you. You are the devil's gateway. You are she who first violated the forbidden tree and broke the law of God. Because of you, even the Son of God had to die. From Ecclesiasticus, an early biblical book of morals, a gift from the Lord is a silent wife, and nothing is so precious as her self-discipline. Charm upon charm is a wife with a sense of shame, and nothing is more valuable than her bound-up mouth. And the one from Mishnah, a sacred Jewish compendium of laws. To the woman God gave 9 curses: the burden of the blood of menstruation, and the blood of virginity, the burden of pregnancy, the burden of childbirth, the burden of bringing up the children. Her head is covered as one in mourning. She pierces her ear like a permanent slave. She is not to be believed as a witness. This last one gets to me. How menstruation and childbirth and parenting are all seen as burdens as opposed to examples of strength, worthiness, and power. Whereas the physicality and roles granted to men are vaulted into godlike attributes. This is where it all started. And that last bit, she is not to be believed as a witness. This ancient indictment is echoed throughout history. It can be found in stories from the Bible to the Greek myths, to the fairy tales we read to children, and the literature we study in schools. It is Cassandra's story, and it is the story of any woman who has been dismissed, gaslighted, or punished for having an opinion of her own. It is the old trope of the hysterical girl or the scorned woman who is not to be believed as a witness of her own experience. But here's the good news. While distrust of women is the root of the story, it is no longer to be the fruit. Part 2 of this book is about women and power. It's about redefining what it means to be courageous, daring, and strong. It's about taking back words and making them our own. It's about doing power differently. The summer that the author Toni Morrison died, I went on a binge read of her majestic novels and essays. For years, she had been a beacon to me, a truth teller, a wayfinder, a culture changer, a woman who bore witness to her own experience and courageously told her story. I remember the first time I saw her interviewed by Oprah Winfrey on television in 1996. She'd already won the Pulitzer Prize, the American Book Award, and the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature. But it was obvious just looking at the way she held herself, listening to her whispery, soft, yet dignified voice, that she didn't need any of those prizes to know her worth. She told Oprah, "I've always known I was gallant." I was struck by the use of the word gallant. Not a word that women usually use to describe themselves, but when I heard her say, "I've always known I was gallant," I felt my backbone straighten and my head rise, and I understood how Toni Morrison had found the courage to tell the stories that lived in her bones and to write her groundbreaking books. Gallant, from the Old French, meaning chivalrous, dashing, brave, noble-minded, a gallant knight, a gallant rescue attempt. Gallant is what Toni Morrison was, and it's what she did. She made a gallant rescue attempt for the soul of humanity. I keep a basket of quotes on my writing desk. I've always added to it. Beautiful lines from poets, mind-blowing bits from scientists, motivation from activists, quiet wisdom from spiritual teachers. Every morning when I sit down to work, I randomly pick a quote and I use it all day to lift me up, to clear my head of petty thinking, to give me the courage to speak my truth, to lift Cassandra's curse from my own tongue. On the day that Toni Morrison died, I went looking in that basket for words from her. I pulled a few quotes out and spread them out on my desk, and this is the one that called to me. As you enter positions of power and trust, dream a little before you think, Toni Morrison wrote. As you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. There's a lot packed into that one line. Every time I read it, I hear Toni Morrison's voice. I hear her telling me to respect my own dreams and to trust my instincts before I allow self-doubt and overthinking to hijack my vision. Her words remind me that throughout the ages, women have been taught to be distrustful of our dreams, to dismiss them as second-rate or soft or emotionally overwrought. We've been told we talk too much, share too much, feel too much, that we cannot be trusted in the realms of power and influence. As we enter positions of trust and power at work, in our active ventures, in our relationships, we get the message not to dream our dreams, but instead to fit ourselves into the old dreams, the old stories, and into the ways it's always been done. But Toni Morrison did the opposite. Her books were lightning bolts of nonconformity and courage. They leapt where no American books had gone before. They took their place at the literary table that for centuries had been set only for white people and for men. They spoke in a different cadence. They untwisted the truth that whole swaths of people who had been stripped of their gallantry were given it back. Toni Morrison told a truer narrative, and in doing so, the meager foundations of Western storytelling began to crumble. When the stories that have glued together a culture lose their potency, things begin to fall apart, but new things rise up. Turmoil and backlash ensue, but so do big leaps forward. This is the clumsy way that human cultures evolve. We're living in a time when the stories that have provided meaning and structure for Western customs and institutions are being challenged. Some of those stories are beautiful, instructive, and worth saving. But many of our foundational narratives that pretend to be about and for all of us were told by only a few of us, and therefore have served a mere slice of humanity. They have set in stone which values and temperaments should prevail, what power looks like, and who gets to have it. For all the many strides women have made, the old stories haunt us still. Religious tales where women are fickle or weak or cursed. Fairy tales where the men are white knights and swashbuckling saviors, bad boys and lone wolves, warriors and kings, and where women are ugly hags or scullery maids, or sleeping beauties and girls locked in towers. Then there are the famous novels where the women get to be one of two archetypes, the Madonna or the whore, the helpless damsel, or the too strong, too tough, too much woman, perfection or damnation. The electricity just came back. When you make a study of a wide range of the old stories, it is stunning to see how many of them serve as warnings against women doing unfeminine things, like speaking or claiming autonomy over our bodies and sexuality or being gallant. The stories steer men toward what is coded masculine: stoicism, warriorship, and violence. They forewarn men against anything coded feminine: the home, the hearth, the heart, the womanly arts of empathy and care. So much of the sorry state of our world hangs on the excess of the so-called masculine virtues in our guiding storylines. So much was lost with the disparaging of anything coded feminine and the erasure of women as protagonists and heroes. This overemphasis on masculinity is what is called patriarchy. It's not my favorite word, patriarchy, but I haven't found a better one. It's not my favorite word because it has the effect of lumping all men together into one camp and all women in another. And if you dig a little beneath the surface of each man and of each woman, you will discover the obvious truth that men are a varied bunch of humans, as are women. To empower the lost voices and undervalued ways of women is not an either-or oppositional proposition. Rather is an act of restoration, a righting of a world seriously out of whack. It feels to me both the right time and a fraught time to be writing a book about men and women, femininity and masculinity. The right time because all of us women are rising up and overturning old concepts and structures, fraught because of the wide gaps that exist between women everywhere. Gaps in our privileges, our generations, our rights, our beliefs. Some women will not see themselves in the ways in which I have experienced being a woman. Other women, and men too, will relate to the whole notion of gender in a fluid way. The variety of women in the world makes grouping all of us into one category a complicated matter. I am aware that any examination of women is an intersectional one. I know that other thinkers and writers are exploring more deeply than I how sexism, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and classism are interconnected. When speaking of women as a group, we run into the same challenges as when we speak of any category of people. Within a group, racial, ethnic, political, religious, gay, straight, young, old, there is both commonality and diversity. Women around the world and even one block over are different from one another due to a myriad of reasons. But even with our differences, and regardless of how we identify ourselves along the spectrum of gender, women still share some similarities. Some from nature, some from nurture, and some from the wounds of patriarchy. One of those wounds is the tendency drilled into women for millennia to doubt who we are, to diminish what we value, to have contempt for our bodies, for our very selves. And this doubt, this shame and reticence can be traced all the way back to those old stories. I'm not saying anything revelatory when I remind us that the people in charge for most of human history have been men. and a certain type of man brandishing a specific version of masculinity. And for most of those years, the world over, women were expected to stay in a narrow lane. Mother, caregiver, keeper of the hearth, mender of the hearts, cleaner uppers of the mess. The old stories solidified those roles, so much so that over the ages, gender differences have been carved not only into our cultural norms, but also into the grooves of our brains. And because of this, because of how womanhood has been defined and regulated, and also because of biology and physiology, women carry within us a certain way of being, thinking, feeling, and leading long denied its validity and power, and now urgently needed. It's a big old soup, this question of women in our times. And often I have wanted to step away from the stove and leave the cooking to others, to the academics, to the activists, or to the next generation of thinkers and leaders. But I have a specific take on the question at hand, gleaned from my years of looking at them holistically, from the historical to the personal, from the psychological to the transcendent. I do not claim to have the final word. I write from my experience and research. I add it to the mix. I do this because I believe these are important times. Humanity has come to the end of a long, unbalanced era, one that started thousands of years ago, one that has been both creative and destructive, but one that has run its course and it's running away with our future. I often think back to that lunch in the Omega faculty dining room, and it's what the classics professor told me. It doesn't matter where you work, what you do, where you live, she said. Women know something that the world needs now. We know it in our bones. We've always known it. I believe it is time for women to dig deep and excavate our voices, to elevate our emotional and relational intelligence, and to transcend the limiting stories of the past. It is time for us to be the scribes and the teachers of a new way, to dream a little before we think, as Toni Morrison said, and to stitch the world back together through care and inclusion. Part 3 of this book offers some ideas and practices to help you spark and enable your own dreams. When I dream of a better world, I dream of men fearlessly reclaiming words and traits that have been coded feminine, feelings, empathy, communication. I dream of women reclaiming traits that have been coded masculine, ambition, confidence, authority. But when I dream of most is women and men mixing it up, blending it all together, tempering power with wisdom, giving muscle and prestige to love and to nurture. That's my dream. I hope this book gives voice to yours and helps you weave the new stories the world is waiting for. Now that's an intro. I just needed to read it again. I've been reading it aloud. I read it the first time aloud, and I had to because every word I highlighted and wrote and saved, and she gave voice to something that I didn't know that I felt. And so I hope that this too can help you. Avalon does too. I'll see you soon.